From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
And so now I'd like to welcome you to the Library of Congress and to the Law Library. We want to thank the Law Library for hosting us and helping us with room reservations. This has been an election year, and so a lot of the room reservations throughout the library have been booked up, and we really appreciate the Law Library opening their doors to us for this presentation today. Oftentimes there's here at the library, our goal is to consider overlaps between various groups, and we call them employee, our employee, recognized employee organizations here at the library. I had to think of the library term for it. And today we have the Organization of Employees with Disabilities that is representing today, and there are Native American employees who have planned this event today. And so we are really thankful that our panelists could come together and would be able to give us some information about an area of overlap between people with disabilities and people from the Alaskan and Native American perspective. One of the things that our office does, and I'm from the Office of Opportunity, Inclusiveness, and Compliance, and we work on opportunities for people, we work on the ideas of inclusion. And this is one of those type of activities where we look at the overlap and we allow us to think about things in ways that give us a new impact or a new insight on items that we oftentimes think about separately. And so I'm really very thankful today to be able to welcome Dr. Gerrie-Drake Hawkins, and I'd like to read the bio that she has. Dr. Gerrie-Drake Hawkins is from the National Council on Disability. They call it NCD. She's a staff lead and a tribal consultation coordinator for Tribal Consultation Coordination, EO 13175. It's involving tribal people with disabilities in federal policy affecting their lives. Understanding disability in American Indian and Alaska Native communities and NCD cultural diversity matters since 1999. Cinda Hughes is an enrolled member of the Kiowa Tribe of Oklahoma, a tribal affairs professional and a former federal employee of the U.S. Census Bureau Office of Congressional and Intergovernmental Affairs for the Social Security and Intergovernmental Affairs. She's also from the Social Security Administration and Department of Labor, the Office of Disability Employment Policy, and before federal service, her national legislative and research work assisted advocacy for people with disabilities. And our third panelist is August Martin, a Central Council Tlingit and a Haida Indian tribes of Alaska. He is a vocational rehabilitation program specialist, Department of Education Office of Special Education and Rehabilitation Services employee, and a Rehab Services Administration. He's the former tribal VR, Vocational Rehabilitation Director in Alaska, and a manager of the Western Washington University Capacity Building Center for Nationwide Tribal and VR Training. So without further ado, I'd like to thank you for attending and to welcome our guest speakers. Thank you. Gerrie.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank your group for inviting the National Council on Disability to be a part of this very special occasion. My understanding is that this is a first to address the issues of disability and to address Native American and Alaska Native perspectives in one program. So thank you so much for inviting the National Council on Disability to be a part. Well, who and what does the National Council on Disability represent? I'm just a messenger today to share a few things with you, and I want to talk the least of all because This is the Native American Heritage Month, and I want you to hear more from our authentic representatives of tribal people and communities. The National Council on Disability is a federal agency. It's very small in number, where you have thousands of employees with the Library of Congress. We have 2 digits, and we don't go beyond 12, and that includes our executive director. Our council currently is made up of people who are appointed by the sitting president. Under the reauthorization of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which is now under the Workforce Investment Opportunity Act, there will be some changes in how the council is set up as far as numbers are concerned. There are now 15 members of the council, all appointed by the president. Under the new act, the reauthorization, there will be 9. 4 of those 9 will be appointed by Congress, and 5 will be presidential appointees. Disability knows no party. Disability knows no age, no race, no language. And so we are the federal ears, the federal voice for disability policy, practices, and procedures across the country. We also have an international interest because other countries have looked to NCD to participate in helping them to try to have something in place around the world for people with disabilities. And many countries are looking at the Americans with Disabilities Act as their model. What the National Council on Disability tries to do to stay in tune with the community, one thing is that we want to hear from stakeholders as often as possible. And when we say stakeholders, we're talking about all Americans with disabilities, regardless of severity, regardless of the nature of the disability. Our stakeholders also include policymakers and decision makers, groups and organizations, families and support systems, and society at large. There are some values and commitments that the National Council on Disability articulates in its strategic plan. 3 of the areas that I think are pretty close to how we are here today. One would be relevance. We look to ensure that the work we do is useful and timely in addressing priority issues of concern to the disability community. The second one is diversity. We honor people with disabilities by embracing the broad spectrum of human difference and by learning about, including and respecting the various perspectives and backgrounds, including multi-generational perspectives reflected in the disability community and families. And the third area is collaboration. NCD will coordinate effective practices internally and externally with traditional and non-traditional partners. We consider the Tribal Consultation Coordination Work Group that we have gathered, it's the best term I can say, under the Executive Order 13175. And we are working in close connection with a group that uses the acronym CANAR. And the people who are a part of CANAR, and I hope I get it all correct, and if I don't, Mr. Martin can help me because at one point he was very involved with CANAR. It's a consortia of administrators of Native American rehabilitation. I got it. Okay. And so The members of KNAR are the members of our work group. There are only 73, or close to that number, of tribes that receive funding from the federal government for vocational rehabilitation programs. And there are more than 500 federally recognized tribes, so you see how many folk are left out. The tribes compete each year. There are certain things that KNAR is trying to assist, and NCD will work as a partner. Legislative connections, what we do, we try to be a catalyst between groups and partners with groups. So we're looking forward to any opportunity that we can in the future to perhaps do some work with the Library of Congress. The understanding Native Americans, understanding people with disabilities in Native American communities is a part of a project that the National Council on Disability contracted over 10 years ago. So that tells you something is needed now, because information that is going to be useful to people, as you know, being in the Library of Congress, must be updated. Our budget is small, and so each year, as every federal entity has to do, the budget has to determine what can we do with the funding that we have. Our future will be looking at future generations. So FY15 and FY 2016, we're looking from the broad perspective of youth with disabilities and future generations and what are some of the needs there. We are looking to move from dependence to independence, from being excluded to people with disabilities being included in society in general, and of course that means being included in employment and in employment markets. I would like to stop here because I believe that your theme, Native by Native, is important, and that it will be very important to hear from our other two panelists. If there's time at the end, I can talk again, but I really want to give them the most time.
Good afternoon. My name is August Martin. I come from the Tlingit Nation. My Tlingit name is Jeet. I come from the Nanahit House of the Chukanady clan. Our people are matrilineal, which means that we follow after our mother's clan. So my mother's a Chukanady, and in our culture and our people, we are forbidden to marry within the same clan. So I cannot marry another eagle. That's primarily because our families are so big, and we run the risk of marrying a cousin, and that would be scary. So my dad is a Raven. He comes from the Raven clan, the Dakhtain Tan clan. If I was to introduce myself to you in the traditional ways, I would have to introduce the lineage, my lineage on the Chukanady side, and then the lineage from my dad's side, the Dakhtain Tan side, and that would probably take up the entire 20 minutes of my time. So we'll go ahead and forgo that. As I speak today, I need you to understand that I do not speak on behalf of the 600 plus American Indian Alaska Native tribes across this country. It's not my intent to represent them in any way, but to share with you my experience and my knowledge that I've gained in the 17 years I've been working in this field. We were asked to talk about Native American culture as it relates to disabilities, and as well as employment as it relates to disabilities. The first thing I would like to share with you is to discuss a little bit about the term disability. Now, in many of the tribes across the country, there is no word in their language for the term disability. It is a unique concept to them. There are a lot of cultural reasons for that I'll talk about a little bit about later, but there is no term in my language, the Tlingit tribe. There is no word for the term disability. In many of our tribes, if a child was born with a congenital disorder, in many of the tribes, they were put to death. They weren't allowed to live. If an individual acquired a disability later in life, that was a different story. For those who were born with congenital disorders, I have a sister who was born with Bell's palsy. My grandfather, who was born in 1898, grew up the old ways, grew up under traditional ways. And throughout my sister's life, I don't think he ever spoke a word to her, because that was just the way the culture was developed for my people. Now, things have obviously changed between then and now, but just to let you know, in many of the cultures, that was a mainstay. If you were born with a disorder, chances are you weren't going to survive. If an individual acquired a disability, a physical impairment of some sort in the course of their life, that individual was typically viewed as a person of honor, requiring respect. And the reason for that is because they were one of the few that actually had the opportunity to either encounter what happens after this life, touching the other side, or they've actually touched it, and survived and came back. And they had wisdom and they had knowledge that they share with the entire community. So if you acquired a disability after birth at some point, you were taken care of by the tribe or by the community. Much of the reason individuals were taken care of stemmed from our values that are taught to us from a very young age. Our elders have taught us to respect life. We look at everything and we see life in everything. We look at the rock on the road. We look at the road itself. We look at the trees, the river, the mountain, the ocean. They all have life. Now, this should not be construed to mean that we worship nature. We don't. What we do is we respect life, and we see life in everything. And because we do not have the ability to give life, who are we to take it away? And so we respect life very deeply. And that value is ingrained in many of us. And so when a person with a disability resides within our communities, part of our value system has taught us to take care of that individual. Now, growing up, some of the values that I grew up with is my people are hunters and gatherers. We hunt. I'm one of the last seal hunters of my people. I go out and I hunt seal. We also hunt deer. We go out and we get berries and we get clams and we get foods off the beach, and we do some harvest as well. But the way we were taught growing up is when we get our first catch, if we catch our first fish, if we get our first seal or our first deer, we are to take that and we are to give it away, the very first thing we get. We give it to the elders first, and then we give it to those who cannot go out and get them for themselves. That's a part of our value system that we were raised with. And that goes back to having a respect for every living thing that is around us. In the Tlingit culture, okay, I got lost on my notes. That kind of brings us to employment. Now, employment, again, is a very unique concept. It's not a concept that is historical in our traditions. If you look back 200-300 years, 400 years, you're not going to see position descriptions for people in our communities. What we did have is when our children were born, we would look for that one trait within them that was theirs. It was either a gift or something that they were very good at. And we honed those skills. And at some point, they would take their place in the community. It was their purpose in life to fill that place in the community only they could fill. And so every person in the community, whether they had a disability or not, had their role to fill. They had a place, they had a purpose in life. And so trying to bridge the concept of employment into traditional cultures has been somewhat of a challenge. I've been in vocational rehabilitation for 15 years. I've been working with people with disabilities for 17 years. And in working with traditional cultures, that's one of our biggest struggles, is to convey the concept of not only disability, which we don't have a word for, but also convey the concept of employment. There has been a struggle, a cultural divide in tying your employment and how much you make an hour and how much you make a year to you as a person and the value you have as a human being. Those are two separate dichotomies, if you will. When I introduce myself to you, I introduce myself to you as a Tlingit first. I'm a Tlingit. And then I'm a vocational rehabilitation program specialist. My value as a human being isn't tied to what I do as a job. My value as a human being is tied to who I am as a person and how I interact with my communities. In the Tlingit Nation, we measure our wealth not by how much we have. We measure our wealth by how much we have given away. So during some of the ceremonies of my people, it is not a rare occurrence to have many of our clans give away much of what they own to the opposite clan. That is how we demonstrate our wealth, because we are contributing not only to the community but to families, and we're bridging ties and strengthening ties between families. We teach our children that they have a place in the world that no one else can fill. We raise our kids so they understand that they have a purpose, and the purpose contributes to the community as a whole. When our children and community members recognize they have a purpose and a role to fill in that community, you cannot measure, you cannot quantify the level of commitment that is born with that individual and the willingness to invest their whole being into that community. One of the most valuable lessons I learned as a manager was to take myself outside of a leadership role as a program manager and recount myself as an equal member to the staff that were under my charge. I would show them a very simple, basic diagram of a pie. There was 4 of us in the program, and we all owned that program. It was all of ours. And so when we went through our policy procedures, I would speak to them and talk to them and ask them, what part of this policy works, what doesn't, how can we change? And as they contributed more of their ideas to the policies of that program, it became more and more theirs. They took ownership of it. And that's the same thing in our communities. When we involve our community members more and more into events and into ceremonies and things of that nature for our communities, they start to take ownership of the community. It becomes theirs. And those are the values that we are teaching our children, and we hope to get across to our children. So let's not forget that no matter the physical or mental condition of an individual in our communities, they do have a place, they do have a purpose and a role to fill. Let us cultivate that and value and pass it on to the generations that come after us. Goroshish, thank you for your time. I hope what I've said has not offended anybody, and I thank you for the opportunity.
Hello, I'm Cinda Hughes, and I'm a member of the Kiowa tribe. I wanted to tell you just a little bit more about how I came to DC first. I am from Oklahoma and was born in a really small town called Anadarko. And I was the first child mainstreamed into the public school system, and first child with a disability that was mainstreamed into the public school system. And this was previous to the IDEA. From there, I went to college, but because the people that were helping me, I was being paid for by Medicaid. Medicaid at that time pays for personal care attendants, but they only paid for 3 hours a day, and you couldn't pick the person that you wanted to help you. So I flunked out of school because I couldn't get to classes when somebody didn't show up to help me. So I went until the age of 32 without a job. And during that time, I lived on supplemental security income, food stamps, and Section 8 housing. And it is a very, very difficult life. Then when I was 32, I got a job working for the Oklahoma State Senate. And I worked there for 10 years. And then I'd always known that I wanted to work in D.C. to do advocacy. I had done advocacy all my life, and so I knew that that was a strength that I had, and it was a calling. So I had the opportunity to run for Miss Wheelchair America in 2003. So I actually won that in 2004, and I was Miss Wheelchair America 2004, but I used that as a means to advocate for policies that I thought would better the situation for people with disabilities and for Native Americans with disabilities. And I came to the attention of the National Congress of American Indians, which is the oldest and largest national nonprofit organization representing tribal governments in the United States. And they hired me in 2005 to work on disability issues and cultural preservation issues here in D.C. So I did that work for about 5 years, and that's how I met Dr. Hawkins, and that's how I met August, was working on disability issues through KNR, through NCD, and in trying to bring Indian youth with disabilities to different events that NCD sponsored or was a part of. And I worked there for 5 years, and then I moved to the federal government because I thought that it was necessary to have more tribal people and more Indian people with disabilities in particular within the system to try to move from that end forward. And I was hired on Schedule A. Now there, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what I believe there should be some revisiting of some policy issues regarding employment. Viable employment and a living wage are the tickets to greater freedom, independence, and the chance to fully participate in and contribute to society. Yet only 1.3%, 1.3% of the American Indian Alaska Native alone with disabilities population aged 18 to 64 are working at all. That's a dismal, dismal state of affairs. I'm an American Indian with a disability, and I think of myself, and this is borne out through conversations with many, many, many others who live, American Indians who live with a disability. And we tend to think of ourselves as being a part of our tribe, being a part of our people, and being a part of Indian country as a whole, before we think of ourselves as being a part of the disability community. And that is something that I think is different within the disability community as a whole. Being Indian is more than just the color of our skin or what happened in our past. As August stated before, it's reflected in what we call home, our family structure, our language. Many of us were raised with Indian value systems and mores and behaviors, and they are an integral part of who we are and how we see the world. Our dreams may be simple, sorry, I'm very passionate about this subject, but they mean everything to us. Success revolves around the ability to live independently, to take care of ourselves, but we live with constant uncertainties. Will someone actually show up to help us today? How will we find the money to eat today? What utility is in danger of being cut off this month? And if we are employed, how long will we be employed? How long will it be before someone finds fault with something about us and will let us go? Which of my coworkers can I approach to help me with my coat or with my purse? How will I get home if I have to work late? We as a society have accomplished much. You know, we have IDEA, we have the ADA, we have Schedule A, we have all of these policies, but there is so much more that needs to be done. Currently, there's only one entity that provides culturally relevant employment services to Indians living with a disability, and those are the American Indian Vocational Rehabilitation Programs that currently only receive 1.5% of the available federal funding for rehabilitation services. Due to the great need for culturally appropriate services across Indian country, that 1.5% needs to be increased to a 5% set aside for tribal programs. And that 5% is consistent with other federal programs that serve tribal members. Further, the Rehabilitation Services Administration needs to establish a tribal affairs office to increase its capacity to serve the AIVR programs. There should be at the very least 3 full-time employees who are tribal members and have a thorough understanding of how tribal governments work. This experience is vital to serve the unique circumstances of Native Americans with disabilities. Further, the Schedule A hiring authority needs to be revisited. It is very easy to hire with Schedule A, but it is also very easy to fire. And there is a 2-year probationary period versus a 1-year probationary period for veterans or for other federal employees. And I'm also a member of the Federal Employees with Disabilities group, and they have gathered information from people with disabilities across the federal system that the retention rate past that 2-year is dismal. Very, very few outlast their probationary period. That includes myself after 2 federal jobs, and I'm currently unemployed. For many of us, reasonable accommodations include our lives both inside and outside the workplace. To date, there is no access to federal tax credits to offset the cost of personal assistance, even though these individuals are in effect financial dependents. We are not allowed to offer inclusion on employment-based medical or dental benefits. This policy is in effect even though our co-workers are allowed to include their spouses and children who are, again, financial dependents in the eyes of the Internal Revenue Service. The cost of living independently and maintaining employment leave little for other essentials. Outside the workplace, there is still a lack of accessible public transportation and accessible housing. Washington, D.C. is one of the most accessible cities in the United States, and it's one of the big reasons why I chose to live here. Here I can take my power wheelchair and I can utilize the metro, or I can utilize the bus. When I was in Oklahoma, even working for the state capitol, very few of the buses had ramps on them. There are no accessible taxi companies within the city of Oklahoma City, very few curb cuts. Now that is predominant across many cities here in the United States, regardless of 25 years after the ADA. Many, including myself, must resort to conventional housing. Accessible apartments are at a minimum, and the price is very dear. There are no federal grants or low-interest loans for renters with disabilities to modify standard apartments to accommodate the disabilities. These factors reflect the definite need for the expansion of federal and state measures and policies. There are 54 million citizens who seek the American dream of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and there are over 500,000 Indians with disabilities seeking the same opportunities. And these dreams are so much more meaningful than just a mere cliche. So I want, hopefully, that we will remember that America works best when all Americans work. Thank you.
We certainly have had more than a lot to think about in the comments and the things that have been presented today. And just again, I want to thank you for your presentations. Thank you. At this point, I would like to introduce to you a member of the Library of Congress employee of our staff here, Christy Dane.
On behalf of the Student Organization for Native American People here at the library, I just want to thank you so much for coming here to speak to us, to bringing your thought-provoking, experiences. And I hope that each of us can take away something. Is there something we want to further research, further question, our own values? What can we do more here at the library or in our own personal life? How do we move forward? I think, and the question of community, how do we serve in our communities? And I think that's a beautiful thought that everyone brought forward here. Are there any questions from the audience?
Christy, could I ask,
Mm-hmm.
would you speak about your experience as an intern in employment and
Mm-hmm.
your decision to come to DC?
Okay. I am from Oklahoma, a small town as well, from Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. I'm a member of the Caddo Nation of Oklahoma, and so I was in college at actually a former tribal college in Oklahoma, and I received a full internship with a stipend to come to Washington, D.C. to work here at the Library of Congress through an internship program. I had never been here. I had traveled a lot, but never to Washington. So I took the opportunity to come out here for 6 months, and I fell in love with the culture and the experiences I had here. So thankfully I was offered a contract, and after some thought and talk with my family, it's a big move, and it's very, very different here versus being in Oklahoma and moving away by yourself, not only away from your family, but away from your community. And so after 10 years, I'm still here, so something worked well. I was offered a contract and then finally a permanent federal position, and which I love, and I'm very thankful for. But I am very glad to participate and to hopefully bring Native American issues, to the forefront, and as we all work together. Whether it's through collections, events, bringing great speakers here. And so I'm glad of adding that work in addition to my position description.
Well, I was informed that I wasn't going to have to talk today. Yes, I do. I'm Sarah Fernandez. I'm one of Gerry's interns. I'm a legal and policy intern at National Council on Disability. And I moved to DC in August. I have to take the bar and stuff in February. But so I'm supposed to ask you guys a question. So can I ask 2 questions?
Sure.
Okay. Do you have like a figure of how many Native Americans or Alaska Natives live with a disability?
27.3, isn't it?
The ADA typically says 1 out of every 5 for general population. For Native American communities, it almost double or triples that. It's a very large number. One of the reasons why we have such a high percentage of people with disabilities is because, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, is because of a loss of identity. You know, when you don't know who you are, you don't know where you came from, you start to look for that in other places. You look for that whether it's in alcohol or in drugs or in other types of self-destructive behaviors. You look for that somewhere else. So one of the things that we've done in our program is that we've encouraged our members to include as a part of their services that help our individual with disabilities find their identity again. Because many of the things that you find is that when they find who they are, where they come from, their life stabilizes to such an extent that they are able to do a lot more than they had done in the past. You know, I found out how debilitating a lack of identity is from a friend of mine in college. She was a Cree Indian taken out of her home in Montana, placed in a non-native family down in Georgia. And she went to college in Tennessee, which is where I graduated college from. But she had never known her identity. She had never known where she came from. And she would come to me, I'm Tlingit, I'm not Cree. I have not as much knowledge about the Cree Indians as somebody that actually comes from that tribe, obviously. But I tried to share with her some things about her identity, about who she was as a Native American. The last time I saw her, she was being let out of the women's dorm with bandages on her wrist. She tried to kill herself. She had no idea where she came from. Her identity had been lost, had been stolen, had been taken from her. My opinion is that the reason why so many of our Native Americans have disabilities, heart disease, cancer, as two of the most prevalent disabilities among our people, is because of that loss of identity. You know, there's so many, I'm lucky, my tribe has never been taken out of where I come from, Southeast Alaska. But if you look at the Caddo tribe, you look at the Kiowas, you look at the Cherokees, you look at the Navajos, you look at all these tribes across the country, they are not where they originally were indigenous to. They've been taken from where they were originally indigenous and moved to someplace else in the country. And so they have no connection to that part of their life, that part of their culture. And because of that, they lose part of their identity, and it gets poured into something else other than their actual identity. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons why we have such a high percentage of American Indians with disabilities, Alaska Natives.
I used to work for the Census Bureau, and the statistics were that we had the highest rate of disability among any other demographic group. Some of that is due to what he talked about. There are also other things, diabetes. Now, the diabetes, that stems from a poor diet. Now, we've been removed from our land, we've been removed from our traditional diets that allowed us to be healthy, and because of the reservation system, they put us on rations and on the commodity food program, which is nothing but starch. And when you are hungry and when you are poor, starch fills your stomach. And it's a comfort food, and it becomes a comfort food to you. And so yes, there's a high rate of diabetes. It's pandemic. And cardiovascular disease stemming from being removed from who we were.
So my other question kind of just continues on with what we're talking about. So a big area of disability policy right now that's growing is intersectionality with other, another like diverse characteristics. And if you, I don't know if you guys are on Twitter, but if you follow disability solidarity, the hashtag, that it's all about intersectionality between race and ethnicity and disability. So just do that if you want. But my other question is, so I'm a Latino with a disability, and my experiences are different than someone who may be Caucasian and disability, or a man with a disability. So how does the Native American population with a disability, how is that different from somebody? Why are your experiences different than someone from a different minority background?
Well, I think one of the things has to do with history and language and being close to those things. As you well know, Spanish offers you a different worldview than English does, as does Kiowa or Tlingit. Gives you a different worldview due to the language that you have at home. Also, as August talked about earlier, that there's a place for all of us in the circle. We're not ostracized, we're not put off to the side, we're not sent to a home, we're not institutionalized. We are within our own family units or within our extended family. One thing that is very different from probably European cultures is that the extended family is huge. I have more cousins than I can count, and aunts and uncles and people within my tribe. And you'll also see here, even here in DC, that we tend to congregate with one another, that we tend to try to find opportunities to socialize with one another, and we gain strength from that, and we gain a sense of community from that. And I do believe that a strong sense of community and a strong sense of an extended family is something that strengthens us.
If you're taking a look at it from a systemic standpoint, I think visibility has a lot to do with it. The American Indians have been called a forgotten people. If you look at current social norms, rarely do you see anything regarding Native Americans that's outside of either a costume or, forgive me for this, a team name. I mean, you take a look at those issues and you center your focus and your knowledge on those issues, you're going to miss a whole wealth of cultural knowledge from so many different tribes across this country. But because of the visibility for our people is so small, to see the power we have is so minute. I think getting that information out to the general public is one of the biggest obstacles we have to actually providing adequate services to our communities with disabilities. But thankfully, as we've said before, because we have such a strong sense of community, our families are tied so strongly together, we do stand in those gaps for those who have disabilities. We provide for them, and they do have a place in our communities, for the most part. Now, whether they have funding for that or not, I mean, we do take hits financially to do those things, but, you know, it's our responsibility. There are community members, there are family members. And I think as long as we view that individual as a person before we look at them as a disability, I think that makes a world of difference. Like I said, I'm Tlingit, but I also have a hearing loss. That doesn't change who I am as a person.
I'm not a Native American, as you can tell, but my work through the National Council on Disability, and before that, the U.S. Department of Education, and working with the, I don't know if I should say this word, the BIA, used to be the title. I've learned from different tribes and going to reservations and pueblos that there is not an American Indian, and that is so important for people who are not Alaska Natives and American Indians to realize and to be aware of the diversity within diverse groups, and that is so important. And when you ask people, well, what do you want to be called? One time we had a Culture Diversity Advisory Committee, and we had 2 people from this particular ethnicity and 2 people from that, etc. One thing that was in common, people wanted to be identified by what their background was first. And so I can really appreciate that. So just so you'll know, it's not just their 2 tribes. I've heard it from other tribal people too.
Hello, my name is Chris Boston. I am Chickasaw and Mississippi Choctaw of Oklahoma, another small town. But I came in a little late, so I didn't get all of your presentation. But actually, the issue on the Native Americans and disabilities is something I'm sort of new to. Actually, I'm becoming more aware because of Cinda. Me and Cinda are good friends. But I really like, August, what you were saying about how everybody has a role and how you really make everything about tying back into your culture. And I can sympathize with you being here in DC, being from an area that has a large concentration of Native Americans, where you feel like everybody's family, coming to an area where it's so, I wouldn't say small, but spread out. So, I mean, it's something that is really, I mean, it's astonishing to see how well you get around and everything that you're doing. And still identifying first as Native American, because that's what we're proud of. So I really like it. That's part of your program. I really enjoy that. What was it that you said?
I'll just repeat everything I just said.
Oh, how you find one of the children, that you find one skill and you hone it, and that they take ownership in that and their place in community. I mean, I'm trying to go into education later on, and if that's something I'm going to take with me, appreciate it. And
My buddy.
but I really don't have any questions. Just wanted to make those comments. Thank you.
So I'd like to offer thanks on behalf of the Organization of Employees with Disabilities. They were not able to, the leadership were not able to be here for the program today, and they wanted to make sure that you understood that there is a vibrant community of people with disabilities here in the workforce, and that people with disabilities do make a difference and are definitely a part of this changing conversation and reducing stigmatization of people with disabilities. It's really the goal of our office, the Office of Opportunity, Inclusiveness, and Compliance, to focus on inclusion and to focus on the people's abilities and make sure that that is first and foremost.
And in closing, again, we just thank you for coming and sharing your experiences and your ideas. And I wish we could say we were a vibrant community. We are small but mighty, I would say, of Native American employees here at the library. So anyway, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.